Spanish, español, inglés version. Bienvenidos, welcome to this session of Justicia Espacial. Bienvenidos a la sesión de Justicia Espacial. Esto es un esfuerzo conjunto entre la Fundación Clave, Agencia de Espacios Comunes, entre nosas Atelier y la Escuela de Arquitectura de la Universidad Veritas. This is a joint effort between Clave Foundation, entre nos Atelier, and the School of Architecture of Universidad Veritas. This talk is going to be recorded, all the talks we have here and conversations, and the aim is to share it with the public here down in Central America. La idea es compartir estas charlas siempre con toda nuestra audiencia aquí en Centroamérica. Nuestros anfitriones, mi persona, el arquitecto Mike Smith, que tenemos esta plataforma en la Escuela de Arquitectura de la Universidad Veritas, junto con Alejandra Fernández, Alonso Gamboa, Cristian Álvarez, Alexandra Valverde y Sharon Salas. Y también nuestro director de la Escuela de Arquitectura, el arquitecto Iván Delgado. This is our crew, our guests. We are the hosts of this event, myself, and Alejandra, Alonso, Cristian, Alexandra, and Sharon, and of course our school director of the School of Architecture, Iván Delgado, and our students in this term, Natalie, Jose Francisco, Krista, Mariana, Valeria, and Caterina. Today, we have the honor to have this amazing person and researcher, Sarah Williams. I'm going to read your bio in Spanish for our audience. Sarah Williams es profesora asociada del MIT y directora del Civic Data Design Lab. Sarah Williams es profesora asociada de Tecnología y Planificación Urbana en el Instituto de Tecnología de Massachusetts, el MIT, donde también es directora del Laboratorio de Diseño de Datos Cívicos y del Centro Elemental de Urbanismo Avanzado. Williams combina su formación en computación y diseño para crear estrategias de comunicación que exponen los problemas de políticas urbanas y un público amplio y creando un cambio cívico. Ella llama el proceso de Data Action, que es también el nombre de su reciente libro publicado por MIT Press. Williams es cofundadora y desarrollador de Envelope City, un producto de software basado en la web que visualiza y permite a los usuarios modificar la zonificación en la ciudad de Nueva York. Antes de llegar al MIT, Williams fue codirector del Laboratorio de Diseño e Información Espacial de la Escuela de Posgrado de Planificación y Preservación de Arquitectura de la Universidad de Columbia en Nueva York. Su trabajo de diseño ha sido ampliamente exhibido, incluido el trabajo del Guggenheim Museo Guggenheim, el Museo de Arte Moderno MoMA, en la Bienal de Venecia y el Museo Territorial. Williams ha ganado numerosos premios, incluido el haber sido nombrado uno de los 25 mejores planificadores de tecnología y Game Changer por la revista Metropolis. Vea su última exposición, Visualizing en New York City 2021, en el Centro de Arquitectura de la Ciudad de Nueva York. It's a pleasure to have Sarah with us. I got the great chance and opportunity to meet her in Cambridge, and truly, she's really generous and always open to share all the research and knowledge she's working on. We are a spatial justice platform. We're a designer architect research platform to understand, share, and develop spatial justice projects through a learning ecosystem that promotes community, multi-sectoral, and cross-disciplinary agency and exchanges. You can follow us in www.justiciaespacial.com. We propose justice, we work with active participation, we believe in empathic solidarity, and we share proposals, of course. Today, our aim is to talk about spatial justice in this space and territorial intelligence, Inteligencia Territorial, and Sarah is going to present her work for the action book she just recently published. Before giving the space to Sarah, I just wanted to say some important things that we are framing this talk. First of all, as Edward So has said, no social process takes place in a uniform way in space. There will always be certain inequalities in the geographies we produce. Ningún proceso social tiene un lugar de manera uniforme en el espacio. Siempre habrá ciertas desigualdades en las geografías que producimos. We truly believe in how we can actually generate information, critical cartography information in the places that we work. Trabajamos con esta información en los lugares que queremos hacer una cartografía y cómo la podemos leer, how do we read it, the geography, the spatial organization of the territory, how can we generate empirical analysis in a geography, how can we record, narrate, have a narrative of multiple qualities, views in the geographies that we build and we shape at the same time. And I'm taking some images actually from Sarah's work at the MIT, from the city data lab, as we saw it a couple of years ago. We had the chance to see her work on site. And at this point of our class, our course, we're working on mapping as a first approach in terms of spatial justice. And of course, we understand the importance of the GIS and the importance of having to know entities, attributes, how can we analyze and manipulate and curate these. But at the same time, in terms of geospatial information, we truly believe this question of who curates actually this information, being critical about it, about the sources and how can we articulate and make sense to this information, and how can we generate our maps about these urban phenomenologies and as a criteria of study. So hence of this, we have looked into different examples and how can we actually address a qualitative mapping. We work in an undergraduate school of design. So also for us, it's important to develop like straightforward tools that we can work in the communities that we address, and to address perceptions, emotions, and how can actually we generate information that is meaningful and makes sense as a collective effort on understanding the territory that we work. And we take these images, for example, from the iconoclastas in South America. These are really sensitive ways of approaching the territory and understanding the stories, the narratives, the people, and how things are interconnected and they make sense within a territory. And these forms of specialization, we try to understand it from several point of views. One that we like to address is Iris Young, the 5 Faces of Oppression, from which we have the work as an important driver or tool in this workshop that we have in Costa Rica. And actually, how can we talk of oppression, but also the opposite of it? And how can we use this as a filter to understand, as a method, to address the territory and understand the qualities and the places that we work at. This is a very beautiful example from Arquitectura Expandida in Colombia, in which they, with a very simple tool, they address the different things in terms of site, borders, occupation, history, urban development. And this is sort of speaking the layers or the layering that we try to address with the communities that we work, to understand the qualities, but also with a very simple tool, we can generate a narrative, a story about the places, and to understand what are the issues, the concerns, what are the forces, what actually have an influence within the territories. So this is just an example about certain type of work that we look as a reference for us, and how can we analyze spatial inequality upon different ways. And here is where we see a lot of value about what Sarah is going to present today for us. And also we have looked into other references, as in Chile, in La Universidad de Adolfo Ibáñez of Territorial Intelligence, from which they have developed very powerful tools to understand accessibility, infrastructure, the environment, and socio-economical issues. So just wanted to put some ideas into the table. Sarah, thank you for joining us, and it's all yours. Let me just stop my presentation here. And there we go. It's all yours.
Thank you so much, and thanks so much for also sharing the work that you're doing. It was really great to see the many ways that you're acting in your community. So I look forward to having a conversation at the end. I'm going to share my screen here. So I won't go into much detail of my bio because you did such a wonderful job, but I am director of the Civic Data Design Lab and also the Naval Center for Advanced Urbanism, which is a cross-disciplinary center which combines research of architecture, urban planning, landscape architecture, and system thinking. I myself am very interdisciplinary. I'm a geographer, I'm an architect, I'm an urban planner, and I'm a data scientist. And I started my career as a geographer, and so I always use space mapping as a kind of frame for my work. I believe multidisciplinary teams are essential for using data for action as they help contextualize the work within the policy arena, communicate its results more broadly, and allow new innovation. These diverse teams bring their diverse training to the table. Here's an example of a team I brought together for work I did in Nairobi, which include computer scientists, architects, policy experts, data scientists, people from NGOs, such as the World Bank. And I believe it's really when we mash us all up together that we can create data for action. And this is the methodology which is explained in my book and the subject of our talk today. So the premise of my book really started with the reality that in the last decade, we have created an unprecedented amount of data, which is only set to increase by tenfold, largely developed by private companies, such as this data set from Google's autonomous vehicle, producing endless representations of the city as cars drive through the landscape. And while not all of this data is closed, like the previous example, in all the excitement from civic hackers to consulting groups such as McKinsey, left a pain on my side. Did all these groups know the ways in which data intentionally or unintentionally can cause harm? Did they know how, in their excitement to do good, that they may be marginalizing or even forgetting whole populations? And while criticism began to mount from academics about the potential misuse of data, as you can see in the examples above, and rightfully so, I found we needed a way to show people how to use data ethically and responsibly. I found we needed to explain to these data enthusiasts and my MIT students alike the ways in which we could use data for a public good and for the purposes of empowerment rather than oppression. So data action, I believe, is a corrective to standard data practices by acknowledging that data represents the ideologies of those who control its use, and at its heart was developed for data enthusiasts, novice, and civic hackers, urban planners, and policy experts, such as many of you in the audience, to provide guidance for using data. So the first chapter of data action, big data for cities, is not new. I position the reader within the larger narrative by providing a historical account of the ways those in power have used data to shape our cities, how they have reinforced structural racism, how data has helped enforce the marginalization of various populations. At the same time, I illustrate the many benefits that analyzing data has provided to society, such as establishing social services and stopping the spread of disease. The juxtaposition of these two outcomes provides a reminder that the person analyzing the data defines its use. So one of the issues that I highlight in this chapter is how data has been used to marginalize and exclude. And here we see Harlan Bartholomew, and he's one of these people that really use and deployed data to marginalize. He was hired by the St. Louis Business District after the Supreme Court made segregation by race illegal in the United States. That business bureau hired him to come up with new strategies to exclude the African American population from certain sections of the city. Harlan really used detailed mapping of the city. He went to every residence to find out race, class, job information, every parcel, every building ownership. And then he used that very extensive data set to create new zoning plans for the city, which made African American communities the only place that you could have brothels, the only place that you could have alcohol, essentially creating incongruent uses with these very middle class communities, and in a sense helping to expedite their conditions towards blight. Many of these communities were very middle class and then became very low class. These methods were written about in Urban Land Uses, Harlan's book, and were used by the Harvard Graduate School of Design in the 30s. Harlan Bartholomew developed 563 plans in the course of his career across the United States using this methodology, and is often considered a master of data to exclude. This chapter also looks at gerrymandering and looks at a character called Thomas Hoffliner, who has pushed around data to help create Republican districts in the United States. He's a self-progressed data nerd, and he started his work since the first digital census came out in the 70s, and systematically used it to push around congressional districts towards the Republican favor. A recent discovery of his personal notes from his computer confirmed how he used data for the Republican advantage, really gerrymandering districts and really trying to make all the districts in the South Republican, something we could talk about in much more detail, but I'm going to move on and talk about chapter 2. It's surprising, given all the hype swirling around the massive amounts of data in today's world, that some essential data is still missing. This missing data usually represents the interests and needs of those on the margins of society, but is often represents topics that governments and companies seek to keep hidden. Chapter 2, Build It, challenges us, communities, and data specialists alike to create the data needed to encourage policy action. The examples in Build It showed us that today anyone can go about collecting data with very little training. This is because innovations in digital technology make it easier than ever to collect personal data. The example in this chapter looks at a project I worked on in Beijing, where we were partnered with the Associated Press. This is one of the Associated Press reporters, to create a device which would measure air quality during the Olympics, something that wasn't being released by the government. Now the Chinese government does release air quality measurements, but at the time, these sensors that we were developed and brought with the Associated Press were the only reportings to understand just really the incredible air pollution that existed during the Olympics. You can see the red is Beijing, which is well above the World Health Organization standards for developing countries, and well above what you would see in New York and London on the same days. The visualization was included in the Associated Press's package and release during the Olympics. So many newspapers can't go to the Olympics, so they buy practice from the Associated Press, as well as the New York Times, who showed our air quality sensor data along the marathon route. And while this had a huge impact in really bringing the problems of air quality to not just Beijing public, who were very familiar with, but the world community, to really put pressure on them to consider the harm that this might be doing and exposing this issue much more broadly. And although data collection is important, this chapter explains how building data together strengthens communities around their shared interests. Building sensors such as the air quality sensor, learning about data measurement, and collaborating with one another creates the bonds necessary to generate change. In a sense, it creates community. Build It inspires us to create our own community data collection projects, not only because they can literally change our community, but also because they can create new ones. While Build It describes how to collect missing data and use it to fill gaps in knowledge, Pack It shows that oftentimes data already exists openly, although we might not see it that way because it's stored and maintained by private companies. In some countries where data is tightly controlled by the government who produces it, privately owned data is the only data that exists openly for analyzing the dynamics of our life. The third chapter argues that we ought to be creative in the way that we acquire and use data. In this chapter, we use a project to illustrate this. This project called Ghost Cities is an example of how we hacked in data. So ghost cities are kind of vacant residential developments, and identifying where these vacancies are can assess risk in the real estate market. But data about vacant developments is really hard to come by because the Chinese government has a tight control. So we thought, could we create a model that helped us to find these vacant developments? Our model is based on the fact that thriving communities need restaurants, schools, places to go grocery shopping, and for entertainment. So we wrote a script to scrape data from social media sites in China to identify these amenity locations. And the idea is that if we could see if a ghost city has amenities, we could see if it's potentially vacant. We got residential locations from AMAP and Baidu, and we created a 300 by 300 meter grid around each residential location. We then measured the distance of that residential location to all the potential amenities. And we took into account whether or not an amenity had a review. So those restaurants that nobody reviewed might not be a popular amenity. We created an amenity score that's based on Hansen's gravitational model that measures urban accessibility, which takes into account the fact that we would travel much further to an amenity if we lived in the suburbs. Once we had an amenity score for each residential cell, we removed the cells below the mean, and then we performed spatial autocorrelation on the cells that remain. The idea here is if you have a high amenity score and you're clustered, you're more likely to be a ghost city. Then part of my methodology is really ground truthing. And we went to Chengdu, Tianjin, and Xi'an to ground truth our data set. And I'll just give you just a brief example of some of the things that we found. Here, we found an older housing block that would be ready for redevelopment, and sat next to largely vacant developments. And then one of the things that we did in this project is really to create a visualization that helped to expose our underlying algorithm. So here you can see all the components that make a particular cell a ghost city or not. So when we look here, and you can see this red cell is very far away from mall or businesses or even a bank. And this was a way to both show where these vacant developments existed, but also as a way to communicate our results with the urban planners, real estate developers, and other people that we came in contact with. I think it's very important to share data with kind of people who are in it. And this allowed us to have a really candid conversation with urban planners in China who looked at this visualization and really began to have a conversation with us about why these vacant developments are happening, why they're controversial, why data doesn't exist, why even the most local urban planners don't have the ability to access it. So we must really work with people described in the data, not only to check the accuracy of our results, but also to understand whether it might do them harm. Encouraging active participation from the groups described in the data or those who will be affected by the results allows them to co-own the data analytics. This goes a long way towards ensuring the ethical use of data and also building action, because it creates trust in the analysis and build new communities around shared interests. Ultimately, we believe we created a map of the foreclosure crisis before it happened, and we did that collaboratively, which is very hard in China. While Hackett asks us to innovatively find, acquire, and analyze data for policy change, communicating the results of those analysis ingeniously. Chapter 4, Share It, stresses the importance of sharing the data both in its raw form, but also through visualizations. Sharing data helps the public have access to information, acquire knowledge, and ultimately make better civic decisions. Sharing data through visualizations can communicate the insights of data without asking everyone to be data scientists. So in this chapter, I show a project, that I did quite some time ago, because I think it still is relevant today. This project I did with Laura Kurgan, who's an architect, Eric Fedora, a policy expert, David Reinfurt, a designer, myself, a data scientist and designer. In this project, we took data from the criminal justice system of where people lived before they went to prison. We added it up block by block, and those red blocks here in Brooklyn showed where it cost over $1 million to incarcerate people from one block. When you zoom in, you find whole communities such as this one, where $17 million is spent to incarcerate people. The idea here is exposing how can we use this money better to alleviate the systematic reasons for mass incarceration. The maps expose our response to poverty is incarceration rather than prevention. And this is something that's been coming up very much here in the United States recently, even though this project was done over 15 years ago. This is really the idea of defunding the police, giving this funds to other kinds of community goals. The maps were first seen at the Center for Architecture in New York, where we exhibited not just these maps of Brooklyn, but also 10 different cities across the United States. And we brought together community members, policy analysts, urban planners, data scientists to think about and how they might allocate just $1 million of those dollars back into the community to help kind of the revolving prison door that exists in many of these communities. The maps were seen and acquired by the Museum of Modern Art, and here we were part of a show. And the reason that I mention this is because a congressman in the United States saw the maps in MoMA and asked if he could use them to advocate for the Criminal Justice Reinvestment Act of 2010. And this act allocated $25 million for re-entry programming. So that's helping people who are returning from prison provide jobs. Ultimately showed how these images can create action. I also mentioned this project tonight because it really shows the power of images. This project was done almost 15 years ago and has still been used very much over the summer as an argument for reallocating funding to social services and communities. This is also a great example of the data action methodology because communicating with data in this way requires the ability to ask the right questions. And I really like to work with teams to find those questions. And so here we were working very closely with a policy analyst, find or collect the appropriate data, interpret the data, and visualize the results in a way that can be understood by broad audiences. Combining these methods transforms data from a simple point on a map to a narrative that has meaning. Data is not often processed in this way because data analysts are often not familiar with the techniques that can be used to tell stories with data ethically and responsibly. So I want to talk about another project in the book that I think really embodies this kind of data action principle. And so I want to take you all to Nairobi, Kenya. And if you're not familiar with Nairobi, it suffers from really severe traffic congestion. And one of the reasons for that are these minibuses that you see here in the foreground that represent 80% of the vehicles on the roadway. And I've been working in Nairobi for over 15 years. And one of the first projects that I worked on was to create a transportation model to help reduce traffic. And when we came to Nairobi, we had no data even about the roadways, and we use remote sensing images to create these data sets, as well as create density maps by counting the buildings. But we didn't have data on the matatus. 3.5 million people depend on Nairobi's matatus for mobility. And we thought, how could we create a data set about where these matatus go, but also create a data set that everyone can use? And so we decided to think about, could we leverage the ubiquitous nature of cell phone use in Nairobi, Kenya, to capture data about the informal transit system which most citizens depend upon, and open that data up for anyone to use and build upon. Our research team collaborated with the University of Nairobi Computer Science Department to develop an application that collected data on routes and stops. Our collaboration with the university was important because we wanted the local knowledge on how these applications are used. But more importantly, we wanted the knowledge of how to build these systems to stay in Nairobi. The collaboration of skills allowed for the transfer of knowledge between both cultures. We collected the data in something called GTFS, which is a data standard that Google Maps use for public transport. It's a simple format that holds latitude and longitude information as well as the name of the stop, as the data collectors were working through the landscape, they were really creating an image of the city. Developing a visualization that would allow the public to understand the complexity of the system became a challenge, and we began to play with the data to determine ways to visualize the information. We began by giving each corridor a color and a legend, but still it was hard to see the multiple routes. Ultimately, we decided to create a stylized map, much like you would see on the subway of New York, London, Paris, or Boston. The map was edited with Matatu owners, the government, and the collaborative way that both the data and maps were developed helped all parties trust the results. And here what you can see is actually the Matatu drivers looking at a part of the map where there are no Matatus, discussing why, thinking about planning services in that area. And you can see even during our editing process, it became an instant planning tool. We held workshops to get a sense if users would be able to read the maps, and we engaged the communities of drivers and passengers. Ultimately, the maps went viral on the internet and social media. Newspapers published them as inserts so that the people without cell phones could use them. And I just like to stop and say, you know, one of the things that I say is that really I like to share data or open data up. And how do we measure the success of how we open data up? And I think that's when other people leverage the data we created to generate their own change. So if you think back to the project of the $1 million blocks that I showed earlier, people are still leveraging those maps. And here in Nairobi, we were really excited when the government, who were largely disinterested in the project as we built the data, invited us to a press conference, really announcing the release of this map as the official map of the city. And I think that they could do this because they trusted the data as we invited them all along the way to contribute and be involved in its collection and the editing of the map. I think them acquiring the map in this way is exactly what we wanted. We wanted them to help provide the public with a resource that wasn't previously being provided. The data became the first informal transit navigable on Google Maps, and we have helped over 40 cities now ingest their data in Google Maps. So if you go to Nairobi, you can map yourself on the Matatu system, but you can also do this in places like Cairo, Ghana, Dominican Republic, through this early project in Nairobi. Because the map became an iconic symbol for the city, the World Bank copied our visualization technique to develop their bus rapid transit map. They wanted to piggyback on the popularity of our vision. So you might not even be able to tell that this isn't our map, but this is meant to be a bus rapid transit map of Nairobi. We have worked together with the local technology community, holding a hackathon, and there's now 5 maps that use our data as their base. Semi-formal transit provides mobility around the world, not just in Nairobi, but in the majority of cities outside the US and Europe that use these systems. And many of these cities have followed our lead, from Amman to Managua. We now have a network of over 40 cities that we've helped or have helped connect each other to other cities to learn how to do this work. The 5th and final chapter reminds us that in rapidly growing data landscape, there is a growing divide between the people who have access to data and those who do not. While data was once something that only landowners and governments controlled, now private companies are accumulating exponential amounts every day, which gives them the same power once solely held by governments. Some believe this amounts to data colonialism, where private companies extract our data as a resource and use it as a tool of control. Let's put the idea of data colonialism aside for a moment. I believe sharing data owned by private companies is extremely complicated. But in some countries, it's the only data that exists. And here, We have example of Facebook. Facebook has more data in African countries than many governments, and it's one of the most used, let's say, websites or apps in the continent. And I think that there is a lot of potential to use data from Facebook or other private companies for a public good. And so we worked on a project with Facebook to actually identify where internet infrastructure needs to be developed. So using a model of various data download speeds, access, who's accessing it, from what kinds of means, we were able to create these maps that show those communities within Nairobi that lack the proper data infrastructure. This final chapter of data action is not meant to provide answers for how privately owned data should be protected, but demonstrates how it might be a new resource and ways in which we might work with the potential of these data sets. In this particular project, we use the data to create something called the Living Data Hubs. It's a new project that I have in collaboration with Kukui Design Initiative and Tuna Panda, which are advocates in Kibera, one of the communities that you saw on these maps that are lacking data infrastructure. We used the map to create a project where these communities co-design a wireless network that's community owned and a data collection tool that's community built. We've just worked with them under COVID to install wireless hotspots, and you can see here community members building, installing this network, and now we're working with them to help generate business plans and kind of sustainability over the long term. Here, the value of using the Facebook data was to create infrastructure. And here, this infrastructure is not just valuable for access, but it's really valuable for social development. So I want to leave you, and I leave all the readers of my book with something I call the data action principles. And so while each story I told you explains this, I want to leave you and the reader with some final thoughts. So the first principle when working with data is to do no harm. And I think it's a principle we can all relate to in all of our work. But here, we must interrogate the reasons we want to use data and determine the potential for our work to do more harm than good. And so really evaluate whether the maps we're creating or exposing them could do more harm. In the case of Nairobi, exposing the informal systems had a benefit, but you could imagine in other contexts, highlighting these maps could really cause a government crackdown and potentially remove an essential resource. So really think about how visualizing and spatializing your data might cause harm to communities that you're working with. The second principle is to build teams. Building teams to create narratives around data for action is essential for communicating the results effectively. And I think in all the projects I showed, one of the things that I think is really important is, really asking policy experts the questions, but also really bringing in the designers and architects to really help communicate those results. And it's through these collaborative efforts that we can really take data much closer to policy action. 3, change power dynamics. Building data helps change the power dynamics inherent in controlling and using data, while also having numerous side benefits such as teaching data literacy. So how, building data on air quality, building data that shows marginalization of certain communities, showing health outcomes. All of these really can change the power dynamic when we build data from the community perspective rather than from that government perspective or even the perspective of Facebook. Expose hidden systems. Come up with new ways to acquire, quantify, modify data that can expose messages previously hidden from the public eye. However, we must expose ideas ethically, going back to the first principle. So when you're exposing hidden systems, make sure you're not doing any harm. In the $1 Million Blocks project that I showed you, the Matatus, as well as these vacant systems, we're exposing something that perhaps people know about, but by seeing it, it makes it more real and can be acted upon. Ground truth. We must validate the work we do with data by literally observing the phenomena on the ground and asking those it affects to interpret the results. We see that I did that in the Ghost Cities project, but I also believe ground truthing is really talking to the community, so talking to the urban planners and the people represented in the data set itself. Ground truthing our models tells us if our analysis is inaccurate. Shared data. Sharing data is essential for communicating the needs for policy change and generating debate, essential for that work. Data visualizations are effective at doing that. We can't all be data scientists, so it's up to us to help share that data with communities so they can advocate for change. Finally, create your own ethical standards. Remember that data are people and we must do them no harm. We must seek to develop our own ethical standards and call upon others to do the same. And here what I mean is, much of the data that exists in the world has yet to be regulated. It's so new, it's yet to have any kind of standards of ethical practice. So it's up to us to create those standards when working with communities. Data action sets out to remind us that big data in its raw form cannot perform on its own. Rather, how data is transformed, operationalized, can change the way we see the world. More specifically, data can be used for civic action and policy change by communicating with the data clearly and responsibly to expose hidden patterns and ideologies to audiences inside and outside the policy arena. Thank you guys very much for allowing me to share my work with you today, and I'll open it up for conversation and question.
Thank you very much, Sara. Amazing. Thank you for sharing your work. And actually, we have a quite a nice audience right now. So in case somebody has the question, you can do it in Spanish. Don't worry, we can translate. Si alguien tiene una preguntita en español o la podemos traducir sin ningún problema. La idea es provocar la conversación. Before opening up to the Q&A, antes de abrir las preguntas, I just want to say that it's truly amazing what you have presented to us, and I have some notes, and I truly appreciate this sense of how actually data moving from segregation into empowerment, and how actually this data can be a source of encouraging policy action and creation, exposing issues, and how, in a way, these tools you're presenting, or exercises of processes, of research processes, actually are an important way of empowerment and making systems visible. As you mentioned in your fourth point, expose the hidden systems. And I think that's so important nowadays within the work we're doing down here, and how actually we can expose that information without doing harm, of course, to make important decisions. So truly it's a local challenge, how this could be for public good, and how we can encourage actually drivers for a change in our cities. So thank you very much for that. And I would just open this for questions or a Q&A. So it's open to the audience. Please, if you can just raise your hand, or you can write in the chat, and we will address the question right from there. So si tiene alguna preguntita, pueden ponerlo en el chat o levantar aquí la manita. Adelante, por favor. Don't be shy. Gibor Camargo. Adelante.
Sí. Hola, ¿cómo están todos? Hi, Sarah. Nice to meet you, finally. Your work is amazing. I am totally fan of you. Voy a hacer la pregunta en español para no confundirme y es la siguiente. Por ejemplo, digamos, si bien la data puede traer ciertas discusiones muy importantes y relevantes al público, en ciertos contextos también puede traer como ciertos choques, por ejemplo, entre la misma comunidad y, por ejemplo, entidades del gobierno. ¿Cómo hacer que la data, más que un punto que se vuelva más como politizable y que se vuelva un punto como de choque, cuáles serían como los mecanismos y los consejos para lograr que esa data logres más bien un puente de diálogo más que un argumento para una confrontación?
Perfecto, Gibor. I'm going to try to do my best on translation. If somebody wants to help me out, amazing. Gibor is wondering about how actually data generates like a confrontation, a shock, especially when you work with local governments. Have you had any experience on actually doing the opposite and actually data becomes an enabler of joining efforts and being more like an integration? ¿Lo dije bien, creo, más o menos?
Sí, creo que es perfecto, sí.
Perfecto. Did you get it, Sarah?
So is it how data can be collaborative with governments, or is it how data can confront them?
No, totally the opposite. To be an enabler of not avoiding confrontation, to be more like an enabler to get joint efforts. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I mean, I think actually the digital Matatu project that I showed you in Nairobi is like a great example of that, and that, you know, the government wasn't creating the data set on the Matatus for lots of reasons, and then we set out to create it, but we encouraged their collaboration in the effort all along the way. They were kind of disinterested or didn't know really what we were doing, but then when they saw the map and the power of the data at the end, they really became partners with us in helping to bring that data out, to use it, to disseminate it. And I think that has a lot to do with really inviting them to be our collaborators on the project. And I think it's important to include government as collaborators because I think it helps build trust in the data that you create, build trusting relationships between the Matatu owners, us, and all the other. You're basically creating a community around the data and a community around this joint effort. And I think in this particular project, it was a lot less contentious because of the collaboration that we have done. I think all the projects that I work on, I do try to like have some kind of collaboration with the government, even if what we are doing might be against, I guess, their goals, right? So like if we look at the Coast Cities project, you know, it might be seen as a criticism of government policies, and in fact, well, it very much is a criticism of government policy, but I invited them nonetheless to critique the work and to, you know, like create an opinion around it. And I think that's important in all of the project if we want to be, if we really want to take data to action, we want to be able to speak to all of the actors that are contributing to that policy action.
Yeah. Thank you very much. We have Sofia. Talk.
Yeah. Hi. So I'm working. So I studied at the Bartlett Space Index, and then I was working. I've been working with Space Index Limited in London, and afterwards I've started my company here in Costa Rica, Urbana's Lab. And actually, what we're trying to do is bring data to Costa Rica because we have seen there's quite a bit of reluctancy of sharing data, of collecting data. There's no knowledge or quite a low knowledge on how to collect data. And I think as soon as I saw your book, it was the first, I had to buy it because I thought, this is what I need. This is what I need to bring this forward. So my question would be, what would you suggest so that we build a bridge between the data that we know these companies and public organizations and governments have, so they can share it with us, say universities, private companies, so that we can do work in the spatial environment, so that this comes forward, because we know this is the future. So what would you suggest would be, this would be the first question, how to share data? And second, well, we know how expensive it is to collect data, to analyze data, to have the knowledge, like to be data scientists, to do so. So what would be like the economical or financial advice on our work so that it becomes viable to be done? So yeah, those are my two questions.
Those are good questions. Very good questions. Hard question. I think for like the sharing of data, there's kind of two ways that you're thinking about it. One is like getting the government to share, and I think that, you know, a bit about advocacy for open government and transparent government, which is one kind of advocacy methodology. And then there's the other, and I mean, I think here is really about putting the pressure on the government to do this and show them the value of doing it. So I think in the United States and some other like European contexts, like, right, I mean, that value is shown by saying like, okay, if you open the data up, others can build on it and create like apps and services that are, you know, really providing a public good. I mean, maybe it's a little bit neoliberal, you know, kind of saying like, okay, the government doesn't have to make that service, so, you know, this, but I mean, I think it is an incentive in any case for governments to open up their data, and that big incentive. It looks like they're being transparent without having to do that much. They get a lot of benefit from it, and potentially, you know, get these innovation sector and people working towards like innovating. So I think that's what I would say on the government side. I mean, I could talk about it for hours, but then I'll move to the private sector side, which I think, you know, I showed just briefly an example of a project I worked with on Facebook, but, you know, the Googles of the world and everybody have, you know, data really that can help society. And I think we still have a lot of work for advocating for that data to be shared, because, you know, for them, there's too much risk in giving it. They're the kind of unknown. And so here, what I think really needs to happen is what I call like data intermediaries, people who help work with between, let's say, the government and these private institutions to make sure that the data is aggregated, that the privacy of people's information is retained, that you're essentially using a data set that has less kind of questions about exposing people. And I think, you know, Facebook doesn't do that work because it's not part of their business, and probably would never spend the time to do that kind of work, right? And then at the same time, like, government doesn't want to like ask, you know, these companies to do that kind of work. So I think in between, there's this area for what I would say data intermediaries that take the data, clean it, and then redistribute it for that kind of public good. This is like something that like Sidewalk Labs was trying to do. They called them like data trust. But in that case, it was Google who was still holding the data trust, so they still held on to the data. So I think, you know, it has to be somewhere in between where academics work well, but nonprofits and other, there's some examples of them, like for NGOs as well. But this is something that I'm like become really passionate about, because I think, you know, also the government, you know, doesn't necessarily benefit from enforcing certain kinds of regulatory policies on these private companies, because they benefit from being able to buy that data to surveil us. So again, this is where like the kind of intermediary would work. So some thoughts. I could talk to you about it for hours.
Yeah, I can talk about it.
Yeah. Hopefully that's helpful.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Sarah and Sofia. Thank you. Alexandra.
Hi, yes, we have two questions from students. We're going to read them now. Hi, so the first one is from Valeria, and she asks, regarding reorganization of space, what tools and programs can we use to collect and analyze data that is precise to work with reorganization plans?
The reorganization plans,
Yeah.
like redevelopment.
She means like with the tools that we have available, like not being data experts, what tools, like alternative tools could we use to make like these reorganization plans?
Right. Well, I think that there are a lot of like new open online tools that are presenting this kind of information. So I mean, this is like, I guess depending on what country you're in. I know many countries have like online census data or kind of online maps like that exist. I guess, my students use this thing called CartoDB, which is super easy to make a map with. You don't have to know a lot about data to use it. And so I think there's another one called Kepler, which is really great at actually producing great visuals from just really simple data sets. So that would be, but I mean, as a person who loves math, there's still the traditional form of collecting data in the form of a physical map, and really, I think it's useful for tracing and kind of really doing some research about development areas as well.
Perfect.
We have another one. There was two questions from another student. Krista wants to know, she read one of your articles, Ghost Cities of China, specifically in the city of Ordos, about the gravitational model of Hansen. So she wanted to ask if this model serves as a mapping strategy and what it consists of, how it can help us collect data in smaller spaces or cities, and if it could be a helpful strategy of working with smaller scale cities like, per se, Costa Rica.
Yeah. So the Hansen's gravitational model, like what I showed a little bit in the presentation, is really like a way to measure like what you have access to, like give it a score. So, like I'm living in my house right now, like how many things do I have in close proximity to me, and then like allocating a kind of measurement of, let's say, like how many amenities. So I'm in Brooklyn right now. I got tons of amenities around me, but I could be living somewhere else. So I think certainly that model can be used and applied to other areas where you're trying to identify, let's say, the healthiness of a city. So like really what we were doing is measuring like how healthy those communities are. And those ones that were really unhealthy, we assumed most might lie vacant. And in fact, we did find most of them were vacant developments. But this model is like typically used and applied for other things. Like one example is access to healthcare. Like how are different communities, how much access do they have to health resources? Or it's also used a lot of times to look at different communities, their ability to get food and food sustainability and food resources. So it's really meant to be used for that. And I think what's different about the study that we did than from Ordos, Ordos is like a big development, like which is like mostly vacant. It's a brand new entire city. This is looking for those pockets of vacancy within the city itself, or pockets of exclusion or marginalization within the city itself. So it's actually looking at this like kind of smaller scale vacancy. The phenomena of Ordos and like ghost cities is is happening, but also this vacancy is happening at the scale of the city, which is also something that we wanted to expose, because this pattern of Chinese development really comes from, they'll build like many, many buildings and nobody will ever move in, but people have bought them because it's a way to like invest their money. Like they did it before the stock market existed in China. I mean, now there's a stock market, but so like a Chinese citizen might have 4 or 5, 6 houses, and so then they create these whole vacant communities. But this is an export that they've developed, right? Like we have these problems in the U.S. where we have whole buildings that are like owned by Chinese that are vacant, and so trying to expose like, you know, that these can happen in pockets in communities and can marginalize. But then you can also look at it for other kinds of aspects of marginalization, like lack of access to transport also.
Thank you very much.
There's one more. I'm so sorry. We're reading the questions from the students.
So Marianne is asking, like, from what scale is it possible, when you have like data from different scales, when is it possible to start seeing like the phenomenon as a whole, or to be more conscious of the issues we are like looking into? Like at what scale can we start delving into these issues?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really good question, because I guess it depends on the scale of your question, right? So, you know, in the ghost cities, the scale of the question were, you know, kind of these smaller developments, but there are some papers that look at it at a more regional scale and then kind of aggregate that data to like, you know, bigger districts. And so I think the scale really depends on your question. I think most of the projects that you saw here were on the urban scale. But I, you know, sometimes I work on the scale of the site itself, right? Like, you know, how do people walk through this site? What are the patterns and phenomena? So I think data at the scale of the site is harder to come by. You know, data at the scale of the city is a lot easier to come by, and then data at the scale of the district is even more easier to come by, but can tell us less about urban phenomenon and tell us more about regional phenomenon.
Thank you, Sarah. Sarah, I see a bunch of hands here, and I'm really concerned about the time. So, do you have a couple minutes to take a few questions?
Absolutely.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Oh, that's wonderful. So, Jose Francisco Bustillos, go ahead.
Hi, Sarah. I have a question. In your opinion, what data is essential when you analyze a community seeking gender equality?
Right. I mean, I guess, again, it comes to the question that you're trying to ask. So maybe you're trying to expose the inequity of the situation, and therefore you might look at something like jobs or access to jobs or something. So I think you always have to start with what part of gender inequality do you want to expose? So the lack of jobs, or the lack of access to certain resources, or things like femicides, which has become something that, you know, showing kind of, let's say, you know, kind of violence against women is also something that people have been trying to expose. But
I mean, like the security in the street, or femicide too.
yeah. That's a really good question. My colleague at MIT who wrote Data Feminism, her name is Catherine D'Ignazio, is like very interested in the different ways that we can get femicide data or even violence data. You know, some ways that people look at that is, you know, use like kind of query news articles and then use natural language processing to identify these femicide locations. But there's other things like crowdsourcing apps that people use to try to do this. But I would really check out her work. like actually she hopes to write a book about femicide data as her next book. So something you might want to check out.
Nice, thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Caterina, Marcel.
Yes, hi. So I was thinking, people are kind of scared that big companies such as Facebook or Google has their data without really realizing that that data can be really benefiting them when used in the right way. So I wanted to ask you, why is it that people are so scared about data recollection?
I mean, I think there's lots of legitimate reasons to be scared, right? In that they know more about us than anybody else, right? In the world. Like, I mean, they know what I'm interested in buying. I got today produced like some. How do they know that I need blinds for my apartment? I mean, and now they're giving me advertisements. So I understand the scary part of it, and I think that's like where giving examples of the possible public good are really important because when it's aggregated and like anonymized and the kind of personal data is removed in the aggregate, it can tell us something. But I think there's been very little examples of that because Facebook just doesn't concern itself enough with that. They have a whole public good section, which is actually how we worked on that project that I showed you. But I would say that they are struggling to figure out what it means for them to do public good. I think right now it's kind of more of we know we could do this, but does it meet our business objective? So I think in a way, the reason we haven't seen that is because most of the time the way our data is used is to exploit us, right? There's very few examples of it not. But if we can show them the way, I mean, that's what I hoped by working with them on that project. But I think still there's a long way to go, and I think governments need to play a part. And, if you're working in our country, you need to be using this data to help us do good, right? Maybe that's like a idealistic vision, but I think, it's the same thing with Uber. If you're driving on our roads, you need to be giving something back through your data.
Thank you.
Welcome.
And finally, we have here Natalie Burak.
Hi, Sarah. Thanks for being here and for your time too. Well, I have a question for you. I want to know, how can we use the data, in an ethical way to generate strategies that bring us closer to an just society and for more equality, gender in a gender manner. I don't know if you understand me. I want to know how can all the strategies that you use to generate and to bring us closer to the goal of a more just society and equality society.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really good question, and I think it's anything we do in advocacy, right? You're using data as a tool to advocate for a particular position. So the more you can expose hidden systems, hidden problems, bring to the attention the public these issues, you can use the data to advocate for. So, that kind of relates to the previous question. You can show the extent of femicide, and show that it's, in a way, data tells. It's problematic. We might know that it exists by seeing it in numbers and the amount of it, really can create change. And so I think it's thinking about the issues that you're already advocating for and how data might help create further evidence for those issues. Maybe that's still abstract, but I'm always thinking I'm working on this project with the World Food Program right now, and they're really interested in looking at the reasons people migrate, but they're actually looking at how much it costs to migrate, out of like places like Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. And I mean, in 1 year, we basically were able to collect data. We found it cost close to $4 billion for migrants to immigrate outside of that triangle. And like, just adding it up, I'm able to make an advocacy position to create some kind of change, right? So you want to think about what is it do you think that would affect the people you're trying to advocate to?
Sarah, thank you very much. And something very interesting about that like, for example, when you expose the hidden systems, there is something that we have been working on, like, when you get all the public media information, for example, in informal settlements in San Jose, so you see all these narratives that they want to pressure certain issues. But then when you talk to the communities that they live there and they present to you their perceptions and you overlap this information, you see a very, like a perverse way of funneling things and pushing ways of dealing the politics of the city. So I think that's very important when you need to validate the information with the communities and what the public media is saying and what the governments are putting into a certain territory. That we need to provoke that tension, between sectors to understand things.
Yeah, and use that community voice to expose, right? They know much better than anyone else what's going on, so collecting their information exactly.
Yeah, definitely. Well, Sarah, I think Ivor has, maybe we can take a last comment. Ivor, go ahead.
Okay, thank you. I will try to do it in English. So my question is that, there is in this market about data, and all this data right now doesn't have like a lot of regulation now. So maybe that is helping this thing about data to be democratized in a very long way. But in the future, maybe these regulations will start to appear, and maybe this could restrain the possibility for people to acquire this data and actually revealing on these hiding processes that you were talking about. So how do you see this future? So we need regulation, of course, to save people's security and privacy, but at the same time, we need to democratize this data. So, for example, academics as you and people at the MIT could keep making these projects, and other people who doesn't have actually the same resources as, for example, the MIT could actually gather some of the data to make this social process. So how do you see this future? These regulations are going to restrain this democratization process? Or how do you see that we could handle this and we could try to pursue another kind of future?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. It's like always the balance, right, between regulation and over-regulation, right? I mean, I think the thing about data, though, is I think it's, in a way, always a bit under-regulated because it's constantly changing in a bit of a new technology. So I guess in some ways is why I'm saying, like, at the end of my talk, like, we have to create our own ethical standards on how to use the data set itself. That said, I do think that who else is going to protect our privacy than our government in some of these situations, like, where, our name, or we could be exposed, or think about if you're riding, you take out a bike share and then you ride it to some place and you can be tracked. So I guess, it's a balance. But I think that in some ways, I think we need to look back into history and think about other kinds of technology and the ways that we've regulated them. So let's take electricity as an example. Electricity is largely distributed by private companies, right? But it's a public good. We need electricity, for our daily life. I mean, most people do. And so, the government, in many countries try to put price caps or kind of different kinds of controls. And I think we need to look at data infrastructure in the same way. So maybe it's not a price gap, but there's caps on how it can be used, but also there should be, ways in which these private companies share the costs with government, if that makes sense. But I think we're still trying to figure it out. Obviously Europe has done a lot with GDPR, which is good as well.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Okay. Ivan, we have our school director. Go ahead, Ivan.
Okay, great to meet you.
Hi, Sarah. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
I enjoyed your presentation very much. I know you must be tired, but I guess just out of curiosity, I wanted to know that if over the course of your work, you found evidence or clues of organizations that do like the opposite of what you do. I mean, that have intentions, to do harm, purposes other than just commercial, interests. But some kind of organization that wants to destabilize a country, a political system, things like that. That maybe some hidden agendas that go beyond, like profiting from political things or commercial, interests. I don't know. Have you?
Absolutely. Like most data is used that way. I think maybe. Sometimes intentionally, but I think sometimes intentionally, sometimes unintentionally, right? Or like the person who's doing it doesn't realize their own bias, right? They have a bias to its perspective, and then they use the data to help reinforce that bias that is very problematic. I see it almost every day if you think about it. Like I was thinking, like the other day, like there was a report about this is like a very mundane thing, but like trash pickup in New York City, and like the way they presented the data, it looked like trash pickup was really good, but then when you start to dig into it, you're actually realizing the way that they presented it was incorrect, and in fact, like if you look at certain communities, they weren't getting timely trash picking. The way they kind of broke down the map created a visualization that is using the data, but is obstructing like the true story. And I think one thing I try to tell my students that I teach GIS and I teach mapping, and to like always critique other people's maps. Like, what are those different colors? Like, if you look at them, sometimes it goes from 0 to 70, 70 to 72, 70 to 3, but the colors are dramatic and they come out equal to us, right? So you can see that. But I would say that no institution would tell you that they're doing it on purpose, right? But you can certainly see it.
Thank you.
I think it happens every day in the most mundane ways, and it's up to us to check.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, Alexandra.
This one is mine. it's fast. Where you mentioned that all this data may help the spreading of diseases, and it brings me to think about COVID and how maybe COVID has opened the doors alongside with the evolution of technology, to maybe be prepared for a different situation if we get hit with another pandemic, how it could be handled and how could it be stopped before it gets to the degree it has been COVID. Like maybe we're going to be more prepared with. Do you think it's a positive impact, COVID, on the data and worldwide use of it?
I think like COVID has brought up all kinds of questions around data, like positive and like, I think like, one thing that's highlighted, in the US is like the lack of creating data on race. So like we didn't even know the inequities and like, so like kind of highlighted really like how we're continuing to not show or count people on the margins. And like, I think that through that exposure, we're doing a better job at like kind of really categorizing different groups of people and like making sure that they're represented in the data. I think it's also COVID, you know, there's some positive things in that way that maybe we'll collect better data. I think there's also kind of, you know, the countries that really did keep COVID at bay, like Taiwan, like they did extensive personal tracking and like, you know, they knew where everybody was. I mean, it was a total, in our minds, it would be like a total invasion of privacy, yet it did stop COVID. So I think there's lots of questions about that. I mean, I still think I'd prefer my privacy, I think. But, you know, I think, you know, that many of my Taiwanese friends are very happy that they've been just like hanging out under COVID and a pretty normal life. So I think there's those things. I think it has taught us a lot. I've been working on a project in Sierra Leone, and we have been using CDR data or cell phone data to actually see if like how certain government restrictions have helped to decrease the spread of the disease. And so I think we have, through the pandemic, like lots of technologies like that and analysis have come out. And so I think we will have a lot more, let's say, algorithms and learning that come from that process as well. So I think there's been a lot of learning.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thanks for the question.
Sarah, thank you so much. I wish next time we have to do this in Costa Rica. Hopefully we can.
Oh my gosh, please, let me come back.
Yeah, we have to make that happen for sure.
Definitely.
Sarah, thank you for being so generous with your time and sharing with us all your ideas and knowledge. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you all for your wonderful questions. I really appreciated it. So it was really fun chatting with you today. And thanks, everyone. Have a good evening.
You too. Take care. Bye-bye.
Okay, take care. Bye.